Over the weekend, black smoke filled the air of Russia's Crimea region after an oil refinery was hit with a kamikaze drone from Ukraine. Two things. Do you think this attack was brought on in part by Victoria Nuland of the state bragging about U.S. military having intel on Crimea and the fact that those were open targets? Or is this Ukraine hitting Crimea in retaliation for the missile strikes a few days prior to that?
The strike that you're referring to was executed with an unmanned aerial vehicle that is a one-way operation. You call it a kamikaze drone. It destroyed one oil tank. The refinery is continuing to operate. How many they fired or launched against this target in Crimea is unclear, and it was in Sevastopol, by the way. And the gasoline, oil, diesel, and so forth in Sevastopol is completely unrelated to the conduct of ground operations in Ukraine. So it has no operational impact whatsoever. And having struck only one tank, quite frankly, it's not going to make any difference to maritime operations for the Russians either. So this is almost more symbolic than anything else. As far as the strikes that went in over the last 48 hours, they're very important. And I think it's useful to pause and talk a little bit about it, because it indicates a change in targeting strategy on the Russian side. You'll recall that over several months, the Russians focused first and foremost on the energy grid. Then, in addition to the energy grid, they began to attack the air defense network. Even though the Ukrainians never had a fully integrated air defense system like the Russians, they still wanted to eliminate as much, if not all, of the air defense systems they could so that they would be able to use their air power without interruption. Now what they've done, having destroyed virtually all of the air defense capability, is that they're focusing on a very new set of targets that tells you something about what's coming when the ground dries and Russian ground forces can attack. Over the last 48 hours, the Russians went after clusters of ammunition, armored fighting vehicles, and troops. One of the most important target-rich areas includes the rail yard in Kramatorsk. And in that rail yard, the Ukrainians had built up 200 tons of ammunition. The 200 tons of ammunition, which is very important to Ukraine right now, since it's virtually running out of ammunition, that 200-ton ammunition storage point was completely destroyed. The Ukrainians lost all of that ammunition. In addition to that, they destroyed somewhere between 20 and 40 armored fighting vehicles. I don't know how many of these were on on rail cars and how many of these were on the ground. I have no way of knowing. They also hit something in the neighborhood of about 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters, killing 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This is important because the Ukrainians, of course, desperately need competent officers. They've lost a lot of officers, just as they've lost most of their well-trained fighters. So the 9 brigades that were struck resulted in rather serious losses in terms of competent leadership. Now, there may have also been some allied officers there. We don't know. British, American, French. We may never know, or we may only find out months from now. But I would not be surprised if there were some of those mixed in, because we have been more and more involved down to increasingly lower levels with the conduct and planning of operations by the Ukrainians. Then when you swing across to Kherson, across the other side of the Dnieper River, the Ukrainians had moved down 3 S-300 air defense systems. These are missile carriers and radars, as well as a Gepard anti-aircraft gun. This is a very useful gun from the standpoint of low-level drones, low-level helicopters, anything like that. It's the perfect weapon system. They were there to protect the S-300s. All 3 S-300s were destroyed along with their radars and the gun. So there is no ability on the Ukrainian side at this point to protect forces as they move forward to close with the Russians. So I think those strikes were a hugely successful operation. And frankly speaking, the loss of the one oil tank up in Sevastopol may look good on television, but it's largely irrelevant to the outcome of operations.
Okay, so it was more the mainstream media needing to keep this narrative that Ukraine is striking back, that they are doing well, that they are equal to the task of taking on the Russian Federation army. But in the end, it was just a bunch of black smoke, literally.
Yeah, it's well, you hit an oil tank, catches fire, you get lots of black smoke, but it didn't have any impact ashore. That's the point. This was not in support of Russian ground forces or air forces. This was really storage for civilian use as well as potentially maritime force use. In other words, Russian naval forces. But you've hit one tank. There are multiple tanks there, and the refinery continues to operate. So, frankly speaking, it's meaningless. But yes, the mainstream media always treats anything the Ukrainians do as though it's a stupendous evidence for imminent victory. Whenever the Russians fall back from a village they've taken because they decide it's not worth defending, it's easier to fall back to existing defensive positions. The loss of a village is sort of hailed as another great Ukrainian victory. We know in that part of the world, given the nature of the terrain, one or two villages up or back really aren't terribly meaningful. It's the same mentality. But I think the change in the targeting strategy really is important. It also tells us a few other things. Russian intelligence is excellent. They know exactly where the Ukrainian brigade headquarters are. Now, we are also providing intelligence to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians recently hit a Russian brigade headquarters. We're doing everything we can to provide them with information, but there's a vast difference between the destruction of 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters and everybody in them and over 1,000 dead versus 1 Russian brigade headquarters. In other words, the difference in capability is profound. And I think even though we give them excellent intelligence, they just can't exploit it on the scale that they would like to be able to do.
So, I mean, so that falls in line with these Pentagon papers of a 1-7 or 1-9 ratio where, okay, yeah, you took out 100 Russians, but they took out 900 of you. Mathematically, you're behind the 8 ball big time.
Yeah, I think so. As far as Victoria Nuland is concerned, I'm sure that people will try to connect her to the operational conduct of the war. I don't think, excuse me, I don't think she's been appointed a general in the Ukrainian army yet. So I rather doubt that. But that's not to underestimate her influence. I mean, it's enormous. She has single-handedly steered this country and our country, by the way, into a confrontation with Russia. She deserves credit for her key role in that tragedy.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you for that. So, over on Redacted, where you've been interviewed a few times, I don't fully understand the details, but the day that Russia, this was around the 1-year anniversary, they brought out their hypersonic missile. I can't remember what it's called. Starts with a K, and they reported that they had also hit like a major NATO underground base that took out quite a few people. Do you know any details on that? Because I've been able to find a little bit in international news, but when it comes to the United States mainstream media, they're silent on it.
Well, frankly, it's been very hard to confirm. There was a strike. It killed lots of people. Now, I've had people tell me the strike was somewhere in the neighborhood of Kiev, which frankly makes more sense to me than the argument that it was in the vicinity of Lvov. I don't know. And frankly, we keep our eyes and ears open for the arrival of any coffins from Europe that contain Americans. And thus far, we haven't seen any show up. That doesn't mean they haven't been moved into the United States if Americans were killed. We just don't know. And the mainstream media, as you point out, is very, very complicit in trying to present a picture that they hope will maintain support for Ukraine. But the truth is, Ukraine is losing badly. And I think there have been a number of interviews recently that confirm it. You've had the Polish chief of staff who has made it abundantly clear that Poland does not have the ammunition on hand to sustain any offensive operation against the Russians, and frankly argues that their stores of ammunition have been vastly depleted by the Ukrainians. That's number one. Number two, that he's repeatedly said the Russians are quite competent. Their soldiers are excellent, very tough, trying to sort of dispel this false notion that's been so prevalent in the Western media that Russians are incompetent, stupid, slow, no initiative, and so forth. There's no evidence for that. And then finally, you have all of this bluster coming out of Prigozhin, who runs the 40,000 man Wagner group. And he periodically makes statements and it upsets people. I think Prigozhin, and this is based on my sources that tell me he has aspirations to run for office in Russia after the war is over. So he seems to bloviate whenever the opportunity presents itself. The fact that Putin tolerates it and suggests that maybe he finds Prigozhin useful insofar as Prigozhin periodically embarrasses army generals or offends them. You know, President Putin has made a couple of important visits to the front, down in the south and up in Belarusia. And I think he's very anxious to get this offensive off the ground as soon as the ground is dry. And so if Prigozhin says, well, you know, the troops that are on my left, or General whatever his name is, isn't moving fast enough, I think Putin may regard that as potentially useful to spur action on the Russian side. Incidentally, the chief of logistics in the Russian army, whose name I cannot pronounce, was just relieved of his duties. And the word is that the FSB discovered that he was effectively stealing and trying to resell engines for the T-14 Armata tank series. Now, why the man would have done such a thing is beyond my imagination. I mean, there's corruption everywhere at some point in time in Russia, we know that. But it also suggests that they have known this for some time and they chose now as the point to reveal it. So I think perhaps Putin and the commander-in-chief Gerasimov were both fed up with the performance of the logistics commander. So they got rid of him. That's a good thing. It's always healthy when you remove senior officers. This is something we don't understand. When two things that happen in military affairs that really make soldiers happy. First of all, if a general goes out and is killed or wounded, everybody will say, well, why would the soldiers be happy about that? The reason is very simple. The general is with them. He's at the front. He's demonstrating that he shares the danger with them. So the Russian generals, we've had many of them killed. People act in the West as though this is something disastrous. No, it isn't. It's viewed very positively inside the Russian army. The Russian soldiers are not like American soldiers in this regard. They don't follow people that they don't trust. And large numbers of senior officers in the Russian army have been removed over the last 14, 15 months for that reason. And then secondly, I think it's also because Putin wants to demonstrate that he's in charge, he's in control. So removing individual senior officers is something that reinforces, his position. And the soldiers also have a great deal of respect and confidence in Putin. He may not be universally popular. I'm not saying he's the equivalent of some sort of television personality in the United States. But I think they respect him and they trust him because he acts decisively to deal with these things. So all of this points to a very serious offensive coming soon. And I don't know if any of your viewers have seen it. There's a video circulating that shows a Wagner armored personnel carrier trying to drive off-road near Bakhmut. And it's driving around in what looks like 6 or 7 feet of slush and mud. In other words, it's impossible.
Yeah.
And that's what people here just don't understand. The mud there is horrific. And the good news is the mud cuts in both directions, stops Russians and Ukrainians. It's agnostic.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that information. So within the last week, Russia basically rains missiles down on Uman, kills 26 people. Ukrainian generals respond to this by saying that they will ramp up an attack on Moscow. Do they literally mean Moscow, or is this just a way of saying against the Russian Federation army? Because they're two very different things in my mind.
Well, the border is 1,000 miles long. If you're sitting behind the Russian border, you've got 1,000 miles of terrain to protect. Remember that Ukrainians and Russians are largely indistinguishable from each other. And almost any Ukrainian can speak Russian, usually pretty well, although they too have an accent that is detectable. But certainly, if you're going to pick people to infiltrate into Russia, you're going to be sure that their Russian is impeccable. And that's not terribly difficult for the Ukrainians. So I think the idea that they could pull off some sort of attack in Russia against some building or target in Moscow is potentially believable. I mean, I don't think it's impossible by any means. The real question, of course, Steve, is how does this help Ukraine? I mean, it's unclear to me that killing a few significant actors on the stage in Moscow would help Ukraine's position. That seems very doubtful. Probably make it much worse.
Colonel Douglas McGregor, thank you for coming on, sharing your insight, your wisdom. We value you. We appreciate your service to our country, and thank you for coming on today.
Sure, Steve. Thank you.